How did a birthday surprise land my sister in prison for 20 years? Maya turned 25 on a Thursday in late September, and I'd been planning her surprise party for 3 months. She'd been through hell the past year, losing her job at the marketing firm, breaking up with her boyfriend of 4 years, and dealing with our mom's cancer diagnosis. I wanted to give her one perfect night where she felt loved and celebrated, where all the people who cared about her could show up and remind her that life wasn't just a series of devastating blows. I'd rented out the back room at Rusty's bar on 5th Street, invited 30 of her closest friends, coordinated with everyone to keep it secret, and even convinced our cousin Derek to fly in from Portland as a surprise. Everything was planned down to the minute, including the exact moment she'd walk through that door at 8 o'clock and see everyone she loved waiting with champagne and streamers. What I didn't plan for was Corey Dennison being there. Maya's ex-boyfriend had somehow heard about the party through mutual friends and decided to show up uninvited, probably thinking he could win her back with some grand romantic gesture in front of everyone. I'd specifically told people not to mention it to him because their breakup had been brutal. He'd cheated on her with a coworker, then tried to gaslight her about it for months before she finally found proof on his phone. Maya had been devastated, spending weeks crying on my couch and questioning everything about their relationship. The last thing she needed was him crashing her birthday party and making everything about his redemption arc. But there he was at 7:30, walking into Rusty's with flowers and this confident smirk like he thought everyone would be thrilled to see him. I pulled Corey aside immediately, keeping my voice low so the other guests wouldn't overhear. I told him he needed to leave, that Maya didn't want to see him, and that showing up here was disrespectful to her boundaries. He laughed and said I was being dramatic, that Maya would be happy to see him once she realized how much he'd changed. He'd been going to therapy, working on himself, understanding why he'd sabotaged their relationship. He wanted a chance to apologize properly and maybe start rebuilding what they'd had. I explained as clearly as I could that tonight wasn't about him or his growth journey. It was about Maya having one good night surrounded by people who actually gave a damn about her feelings. Corey's expression shifted from confident to annoyed, and he told me I was being controlling and that Maya was an adult who could decide for herself whether she wanted to talk to him. The argument was getting heated when Maya's best friend Sienna intervened, agreeing with me that Corey needed to go. Other guests started gathering around, and Corey realized he wasn't going to get the support he'd expected. He finally agreed to leave, but not before making a scene about how everyone was turning against him and how Maya would regret not hearing him out. He shoved the flowers into my hands and stormed toward the exit, muttering something about us all being judgmental. I felt relieved watching him leave, thinking I'd successfully protected Maya from an uncomfortable confrontation on her birthday. I set the flowers on the bar and told everyone to get back to their positions because Maya would be arriving in 20 minutes. The mood had shifted slightly, everyone a bit on edge from the confrontation, but I was determined to salvage the energy before my sister walked through that door. Maya arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, pushed through the door by our cousin Tessa, who'd been tasked with getting her there under the pretense of a casual dinner. The look on Maya's face when everyone yelled surprise was worth every hour of planning, pure shock, followed by this beautiful smile that made her look 10 years younger. She started crying happy tears as people rushed to hug her, and for those first 30 minutes, everything was perfect. Music played, drinks flowed, and Maya moved through the room laughing and catching up with friends she hadn't seen in months. I watched from the bar feeling proud that I'd pulled this off, that I'd given my sister exactly what she needed. She came over around 8:30 to hug me and whisper that this was the best birthday she'd ever had, that she couldn't believe I'd managed to keep it secret. I hugged her back and told her she deserved it, that things were going to get better from here. Around 9 o'clock, Maya asked where the bathroom was, and I directed her down the hallway past the kitchen. She was gone for maybe 5 minutes when I heard shouting from that direction. My first thought was that someone had gotten too drunk too quickly, but then I recognized Maya's voice screaming for someone to get away from her. I ran toward the sound with several other guests following behind me. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, and what I saw when I rounded the corner made my blood go cold. Corey had Maya pinned against the wall, one hand on her shoulder and the other holding his phone up to her face, trying to show her something while she struggled to push him away. She was telling him to let go, her voice high and panicked in a way I'd never heard before. I didn't think, just reacted, grabbing Corey by the shoulder and yanking him backward. Corey stumbled and turned to face me, his expression shifting from desperate to angry. He started yelling that I'd ruined everything, that he'd just been trying to talk to Maya and show her the messages from his therapist proving he was getting help. Maya was behind him now, breathing hard and looking terrified. I told Corey he needed to leave immediately or I was calling the police. He laughed bitterly and said Maya was being dramatic, that he'd barely touched her, and that everyone was acting like he was some kind of monster when all he wanted was to apologize. Other guests had gathered in the hallway now, and someone, I think it was Derek, told Corey to listen to what Maya wanted, instead of forcing his presence on her. The tension was thick enough to choke on, and I could see Corey's hands clenching into fists as he realized the entire party was against him. That's when Maya spoke, her voice shaking but clear. She told Corey that what he'd just done, cornering her in a hallway and physically restraining her, was exactly why she'd broken up with him in the first place. He didn't respect her boundaries or her autonomy. He only cared about what he wanted and would manipulate or force situations to get it. She said she never wanted to see him again, and that if he didn't leave right now, she would get a restraining order. Something in Corey's face changed when she said that, his expression going from angry to something darker that I couldn't quite read. He took a step toward her and I moved between them instinctively, putting my hand on his chest to keep him back. Corey looked at my hand like I'd just committed an unforgivable offense, then shoved me backward hard enough that I stumbled into the wall. The hallway erupted in chaos with multiple people shouting and Derek grabbing Corey's arm to pull him away from me. In the confusion, I didn't see Maya grab the glass bottle from the recycling bin near the bathroom door. I didn't see her swing it with all her strength at the back of Corey's head while he was focused on Derek. I only heard the sickening crack of glass meeting skull and then watched Corey drop to his knees, blood immediately pouring from a gash above his ear. The bottle had shattered on impact, and Maya was standing there holding the broken neck of it, her face white with shock at what she'd just done. Time seemed to stop as everyone processed what had happened. Corey collapsed forward onto his hands, blood dripping onto the hardwood floor in an expanding pool that looked black in the dim lighting. Someone screamed. Someone else yelled to call an ambulance. I moved toward Maya to take the broken bottle from her hand before she hurt herself on the jagged glass, and that's when Corey started seizing. The next 15 minutes were a blur of emergency response and panic. Someone had called 911, and paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, pushing through the crowd of guests who'd all witnessed what happened. They stabilized Corey's head and neck, worked to stop the bleeding, and loaded him onto a stretcher while asking questions about what had occurred. Maya was sitting on the floor now, shock setting in, unable to form coherent sentences. The police arrived as the ambulance was leaving, and suddenly we were all being separated for questioning. I tried to stay with Maya, but an officer told me to wait in the main bar area while they interviewed her privately. I sat there with blood on my shirt, Corey's blood from when I'd tried to help him, and watched officers take statements from guests who'd witnessed the assault. The word assault kept running through my mind, because that's what it was, wasn't it? Maya had hit someone with a bottle. She'd caused serious injury. Even if Corey had been harassing her, even if he'd shoved me first, she'd escalated to violence. They took Maya to the police station around 10:30, and I followed in my car after giving my own statement to officers. The party was obviously over, guests leaving in shocked groups, whispering about what they'd seen. Sienna rode with me, both of us silent during the 15-minute drive to the station. We sat in the waiting area for hours, while Maya was processed and interviewed. Around 2 a.m, a detective named Angela Reeves came out to speak with us. She explained that Maya was being charged with aggravated assault, that Corey was in surgery for a skull fracture and brain bleed, and that bail would be set in the morning. I asked if Maya could come home tonight, and Detective Reeves said no, she'd be held overnight until the arraignment. The look of sympathy on her face told me this was serious, in a way I hadn't fully grasped yet. Maya had fractured someone's skull. He might have permanent brain damage. This wasn't going to be resolved with an apology and community service. I hired a lawyer first thing Friday morning, a criminal defense attorney named Graham Kellerman, who specialized in assault cases. He met with Maya at the jail before the arraignment, and then sat down with me to explain the situation. Corey had survived surgery, but was in critical condition with significant brain swelling. The doctors weren't sure yet what the long-term effects would be. Maya was being charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon because the broken bottle qualified as such under state law. If convicted, she could face up to 20 years in prison. I felt the floor drop out from under me as Graham explained this. 20 years. My sister could spend the next 2 decades in prison for defending herself at her own birthday party. Graham said we had a strong self-defense argument given Corey's behavior, the cornering, the physical restraint, the shove, but that the prosecution might argue Maya used excessive force by hitting him from behind while he was engaged with someone else. The fact that Corey wasn't actively attacking her at the moment she struck him complicated the self-defense claim. The arraignment was a nightmare. Maya stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. The prosecutor, a severe woman named Catherine Brennan, argued that Maya had committed a brutal assault that left the victim with life-threatening injuries. She emphasized that Maya had hit Corey from behind with a bottle, that he hadn't been facing her or posing an immediate threat at that exact moment, and that the force used was excessive and intended to cause serious harm. Graham countered that Corey had been harassing and physically restraining Maya, that he'd shoved me, and that Maya had acted in defense of herself and others. The judge set bail at $50,000, which our family barely managed to scrape together by putting up our mom's house as collateral. Maya came home Friday evening, and we sat in my living room in silence, both of us trying to process what had happened in the past 24 hours. Over the next few weeks, Corey's condition dominated everything. He survived the initial crisis but remained in a medically induced coma while doctors waited for the brain swelling to decrease. His family gave a press conference demanding justice, showing photos of Corey before the assault, smiling, healthy, successful, and condemning Maya as a violent criminal who'd tried to murder him over a breakup. The media picked up the story, and suddenly Maya's case was all over local news. The narrative varied depending on the source. Some outlets portrayed Maya as a victim who'd defended herself against a stalker. Others painted her as an unstable woman who'd brutally attacked her ex-boyfriend at a party. The truth was, somewhere in the middle, but nuance didn't matter in the court of public opinion. Maya's social media accounts were flooded with hate messages from people who'd never met her, calling her a monster and demanding she get the maximum sentence. She deleted everything and barely left my apartment, too scared to face the world. Graham worked on building our defense, interviewing witnesses from the party, and gathering evidence of Corey's pattern of harassment. We found texts from Corey to Maya sent in the weeks before the party, messages where he alternated between apologizing profusely and blaming her for the breakup. Some were manipulative, telling her she'd never find anyone who loved her like he did. Others were angry, calling her ungrateful for not appreciating his efforts to change. We also found messages between Corey and his friends where he'd discussed plans to win her back at the party, making it clear he'd known he wasn't invited, but intended to show up anyway. Graham said this evidence was crucial for establishing that Corey's presence was unwanted and that his behavior constituted harassment. But Catherine Brennan, the prosecutor, had her own evidence. She had security footage from Rusty's bar showing the moment Maya hit Corey, footage that clearly showed his back was turned and he was engaged with Derek when she struck him. The preliminary hearing happened in late October, exactly 1 month after the party. Both sides presented their evidence to determine if there was enough to proceed to trial. Graham put me on the stand to testify about Corey's behavior that night, how he'd refused to leave when asked, how he'd cornered Maya in the hallway, how he'd shoved me when I'd tried to intervene. I described the fear on Maya's face when Corey had her pinned against the wall, the way her voice had sounded when she'd screamed for help. Catherine Brennan cross-examined me aggressively, asking if Maya had been in immediate danger at the moment she swung the bottle. I had to admit that Corey hadn't been directly threatening her at that exact second, that he'd been turned away from her. Brennan suggested that Maya's action was revenge rather than self-defense, that she'd taken advantage of Corey being distracted to attack him from behind. The implication made my blood boil, but I couldn't argue with the facts as they appeared on the security footage. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, setting a date for January. Maya's mental state deteriorated as we waited. She'd always been strong and independent, but the stress of facing 20 years in prison broke something in her. She stopped eating properly, lost 20 pounds, and developed insomnia that left her hollow-eyed and exhausted. Our mom tried to be supportive, but was dealing with her own cancer treatment and couldn't handle the additional stress. I became Maya's primary support system, attending every meeting with Graham, researching case law, and trying to keep her from completely falling apart. Some nights, she'd have panic attacks so severe I'd have to talk her down for hours, reminding her to breathe, promising her we'd fight this and she wouldn't go to prison. But I wasn't sure I believed my own words. The evidence was complicated, and I'd seen enough courtroom dramas to know that self-defense cases were unpredictable. In December, Corey woke from his coma. The news hit us like a bomb because we'd been hoping he'd make a full recovery, and perhaps that would help Maya's case. But the medical reports were devastating. Corey had significant brain damage affecting his motor skills, speech, and memory. He'd need years of rehabilitation and would likely never return to his previous level of functioning. His family immediately amended their victim impact statements, providing detailed information about Corey's disabilities and reduced quality of life. They blamed Maya for destroying their son's future, for stealing his career as an architect, for making him dependent on others for basic care. The prosecutor incorporated this information into her case, arguing that Maya hadn't just assaulted Corey, but had permanently disabled him, causing harm that justified the maximum sentence. Graham tried to argue that the extent of injury was unfortunate, but didn't change the fact that Maya had been defending herself. Catherine Brennan countered that excessive force resulting in permanent disability went beyond reasonable self-defense. The trial began on a freezing Monday in January, with jury selection taking 3 full days. Graham wanted jurors who could empathize with Maya's fear and understand the dynamics of harassment. Catherine Brennan wanted jurors who valued law and order, who would see Maya's action as an inexcusable escalation of violence. They settled on 12 people, 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 26 to 63. I studied their faces trying to guess who might be sympathetic to my sister, but they all maintained neutral expressions that revealed nothing. Opening statements laid out the competing narratives. Brennan portrayed Maya as a jealous ex-girlfriend who'd violently attacked a man trying to apologize. She showed photos of Corey's injuries, described the surgeries required to save his life, and detailed his current disabilities. Graham portrayed Maya as a frightened woman who'd been stalked and cornered by an ex-boyfriend who wouldn't accept rejection. He described Corey's pattern of harassment and explained that Maya had acted in a moment of terror, believing she and others were in danger. The prosecution called witnesses first, starting with paramedics who'd responded to the scene. They described the severity of Corey's injuries, the amount of blood loss, and the emergency interventions required. Corey's neurosurgeon testified about the skull fracture and brain bleed, explaining that without immediate surgery, Corey would have died. The testimony was clinical but devastating, painting a picture of catastrophic injury that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. Catherine Brennan then called guests from the party who'd witnessed the assault. Their testimonies varied in helpful ways for both sides. Some described Corey as aggressive and threatening. Others said he'd seemed upset but not violent. Everyone agreed that Maya had hit him from behind while his attention was elsewhere, which was Brennan's key point. She argued repeatedly that whatever Corey's behavior earlier in the evening, he hadn't been actively attacking anyone at the moment Maya struck him. Corey himself was called to testify on the fourth day of trial. Watching him shuffle to the witness stand with a cane, his speech slow and slurred from brain damage, was one of the hardest things I'd ever witnessed. Not because I felt sorry for him, I was still angry about what he'd put Maya through, but because the jury's reaction was palpable. They saw a disabled young man struggling to communicate, and it was impossible not to feel sympathy regardless of his actions that night. Corey testified that he'd only wanted to talk to Maya, to show her he'd changed. He admitted he'd been upset about the breakup and had made mistakes, but insisted he'd never intended to hurt anyone. He said he didn't remember the actual assault, just waking up in the hospital weeks later with doctors explaining what had happened. His memory of the party was fragmented, but he was certain he hadn't been violent or threatening. He claimed Maya had overreacted because she was still angry about the infidelity, not because she genuinely feared for her safety. Graham's cross-examination focused on Corey's text messages and his refusal to leave when asked. He confronted Corey with his own words, messages where he'd called Maya ungrateful and said she'd regret leaving him. Corey tried to explain these away as emotional outbursts from a difficult time, that he'd been hurt and lashing out. Graham asked why Corey had shown up to a party he hadn't been invited to, and Corey said he'd thought Maya would want to see him once she realized how hard he was working on himself. Graham asked if cornering someone in a hallway was an appropriate way to have that conversation, and Corey insisted he'd just been trying to talk privately, that Maya's reaction had been disproportionate to his actions. The cross-examination revealed Corey's sense of entitlement and inability to accept rejection, but it also showed a man with significant brain damage struggling to defend himself against an experienced attorney. The jury's sympathy seemed to shift further toward Corey as Graham pressed him on details he couldn't remember due to his injury. The defense case began with witnesses who'd seen Corey's behavior firsthand. Derek testified about Corey refusing to leave when asked, about finding him in the hallway with Maya pinned against the wall, about being shoved when he'd tried to intervene. Sienna testified about Maya's emotional state in the months after the breakup, about the trauma Corey's infidelity and gaslighting had caused. Graham called a domestic violence expert who explained the pattern of behavior Corey had exhibited, the harassment, the boundary violations, the inability to accept rejection. The expert testified that victims of this kind of stalking often feel trapped and desperate, that Maya's fear that night would have been genuine and justified. But Catherine Brennan's cross-examination was brutal. She got the expert to admit that while Corey's behavior was problematic, it didn't meet the legal definition of stalking. She emphasized that feeling scared didn't justify hitting someone with a bottle hard enough to fracture their skull, especially when that person wasn't directly threatening you at the moment of assault. Maya testified on the 8th day of trial, and I watched from the gallery with my hands clenched so tight my nails drew blood. She described the relationship with Corey, the infidelity, the gaslighting, and the painful breakup. She explained how she'd tried to move on, but Corey wouldn't let her, sending messages and showing up places he knew she'd be. She described her shock when she'd seen him at the party, and her fear when he'd cornered her in the hallway. Her voice broke when she talked about his hand on her shoulder, how trapped she'd felt, how her brain had gone into panic mode. She said when she'd seen him shove me and then engage with Derek, she'd been terrified the situation would escalate further, that someone would get seriously hurt. She'd grabbed the bottle without thinking, acting on pure instinct to stop the threat before it got worse. She said she never meant to hurt him as badly as she did, that she was horrified by the outcome, but she genuinely believed she and others were in danger. Catherine Brennan's cross-examination was devastating. She walked Maya through the timeline of events, forcing her to admit that Corey hadn't been facing her when she'd struck him. She asked if Corey had been holding a weapon, and Maya had to say no. She asked if Corey had hit anyone besides pushing me, and Maya said no. Brennan suggested that Maya had been angry about Corey crashing her party and ruining her birthday, that the assault had been about revenge rather than defense. Maya insisted that wasn't true, that she'd been scared, but Brennan kept pressing. She asked why Maya had grabbed a bottle if she'd really just been afraid. Why not run? Why not yell for help since there were dozens of people nearby? Why hit Corey from behind with enough force to potentially kill him? Maya couldn't articulate a good answer, just repeated that she'd been terrified and reacted without thinking. Brennan's final question hit like a hammer. Ms. Crawford, do you think giving Corey Dennison permanent brain damage was an appropriate response to him trying to talk to you? Maya broke down, crying, unable to answer. Closing arguments happened on a Friday afternoon with both attorneys delivering passionate summaries of their cases. Graham argued that Maya had been a victim of harassment, who'd acted to protect herself and others in a moment of genuine fear. He emphasized Corey's pattern of boundary violations and the terror Maya had experienced. He asked the jury to consider what they would have done in her position, cornered by an ex who wouldn't leave them alone. Catherine Brennan argued that regardless of Corey's behavior, Maya's response had been disproportionate and had occurred when Corey wasn't actively threatening her. She showed the security footage again, pointing out that Corey's back was turned, that he was several feet away from Maya, and that she'd had multiple other options besides violence. She asked the jury to consider Corey's current condition, the life he'd lost, and the message it would send if they let someone get away with causing that kind of permanent harm. Both attorneys were compelling, and I had no idea which narrative the jury would believe. The jury deliberated for 3 days, which Graham said could be either very good or very bad for us. It meant they were taking the case seriously and considering all the evidence, but it also meant there was disagreement about the verdict. We waited in a conference room at Graham's office, unable to focus on anything else. Maya barely spoke, just stared at the wall with this empty expression that scared me more than her earlier panic attacks. Our mom came to wait with us, weak from chemotherapy, but determined to be there for her daughter. On the 3rd day, late Wednesday afternoon, we got the call that the jury had reached a verdict. We drove to the courthouse in silence, and the walk from the parking garage to the courtroom felt like miles. The gallery was packed with media, Corey's family, and supporters on both sides. I sat directly behind Maya, close enough to touch her shoulder through the bar separating the gallery from the defense table. The jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict, a middle-aged woman in a blue sweater who'd been impossible to read throughout the trial. The judge asked if they'd reached a unanimous verdict, and the foreman confirmed they had. My heart was beating so hard I thought everyone could hear it. The foreman read from a paper in a steady voice. "We, the jury, find the defendant Maya Crawford guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon." The courtroom erupted in noise. Corey's family cheering and crying, Maya collapsing forward onto the defense table, Graham putting his hand on her back, the judge banging his gavel and demanding order. I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just heard. Guilty. My sister was guilty. She was going to prison. The judge set sentencing for 3 weeks later and remanded Maya to custody until then, denying bail now that she'd been convicted. Officers came to take her away, and she looked back at me with this expression of complete devastation. I wanted to say something comforting, but no words came out. I just watched them lead my sister out of the courtroom in handcuffs while Corey's family celebrated their victory. The sentencing hearing was worse than the trial. Catherine Brennan called multiple witnesses to speak about the impact of Maya's crime. Corey testified again about his disabilities and how Maya had stolen his future. His mother sobbed through a victim impact statement about caring for her adult son who could no longer live independently. His former employer testified that Corey's career was over, that the brain damage prevented him from performing the complex spatial reasoning required for architecture. Medical experts detailed the ongoing treatment Corey would need for the rest of his life. The cumulative effect painted Maya as someone who'd destroyed not just one life, but an entire family. Graham tried to counter with character witnesses for Maya, friends, co-workers, teachers who'd known her as kind and non-violent. Our mom testified about Maya's compassion and how out of character this incident had been. But nothing could erase the severity of Corey's injuries or the permanence of the damage Maya had caused. The judge took an hour to deliver his sentence, walking through aggravating and mitigating factors. He acknowledged that Corey's behavior had been inappropriate and that Maya had experienced genuine fear, but he emphasized that her response had been excessive, that she'd caused catastrophic injury from an action that went beyond reasonable self-defense. He noted her lack of criminal history and the circumstances of the incident, but said those factors couldn't outweigh the severity of harm caused. He sentenced Maya to 18 years in state prison with possibility of parole after 12 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. 18 years. My sister would be 43 years old when she got out. If she got out at the first parole hearing, she'd miss everything. Our mom's final years, potential marriages, children, careers, life, all because she'd reacted in fear at her own birthday party. Maya didn't react to the sentence, just sat there staring straight ahead while officers prepared to take her away. I tried to get to her, but deputies blocked my path. The last thing I saw before they let her out was her glancing back at me, and the emptiness in her eyes was more terrifying than any emotion would have been. The appeals process took 3 years and resulted in nothing. Graham argued that the sentence was excessive given the circumstances, that the jury should have been allowed to consider lesser charges, that the judge had made errors in allowing certain evidence. Every appeal was denied. Maya's conviction and sentence stood. I visited her in prison every month, watching my vibrant, intelligent sister become a shell of who she'd been. She went through the motions of rehabilitation programs because it would look good for parole, but her spirit was broken. She told me once that she couldn't forgive herself for what she'd done to Corey, that regardless of his behavior, she'd permanently disabled someone, and nothing could justify that. I tried to remind her that she'd been scared, that she'd acted in self-defense, but she'd stopped believing that narrative. The jury hadn't believed it either, so why should she? Our mom died 2 years after the sentencing, and Maya wasn't allowed to attend the funeral because she was in maximum security. I held our mom's hand as she died and promised I'd take care of Maya, a promise that felt impossibly heavy given that Maya was locked away for another decade at minimum. 5 years into Maya's sentence, I finally got the courage to reach out to one of the jurors who'd convicted her. I'd been obsessing over the trial, trying to understand how they'd reached their verdict. A woman named Denise Fuller agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. She was in her 50s, a teacher who'd served as an alternate juror, but had been part of the deliberations. She told me the jury had been split initially, with 7 wanting to acquit and 5 wanting to convict. The holdouts had focused on the security footage, on the fact that Corey's back had been turned and he hadn't been directly threatening Maya at that exact moment. The debate had centered on whether fear of future harm justified preemptive violence. Eventually, the self-defense supporters had been convinced that the law required immediate threat, not anticipated threat. Denise said she'd personally felt terrible about the verdict, but believed they'd followed the law as the judge had instructed. Hearing that the jury had been close to acquitting Maya made everything worse somehow, like she'd lost her freedom by a handful of votes. 7 years into her sentence, Corey died from complications related to his brain injury. I read about it in the newspaper, an obituary describing a young man whose life had been cut short by a violent assault. His family held a memorial service and spoke to media about how Maya should have gotten a longer sentence, how 18 years hadn't been enough for what she'd taken from them. I felt a complicated mix of emotions reading about his death. I still believed Corey had brought the situation on himself through his harassment and inability to respect boundaries. But he'd been 28 years old, and now he was dead, and Maya had played a role in that, even if she hadn't intended the outcome. I didn't tell Maya about his death until she found out from another inmate who'd seen it on the news. She had another breakdown, convinced that she was now essentially a murderer, even though technically Corey's death was listed as complications from a past injury rather than homicide. Her parole hearing was scheduled for the following year, and I prayed the board would see that she'd been rehabilitated and posed no threat to society. The parole hearing happened on a Thursday in August, 12 years almost to the day from the night that had destroyed everything. Maya had served her minimum sentence and was eligible for release. Graham had moved to a different firm, but came back to represent Maya at the hearing, preparing her to speak to the board about her rehabilitation and remorse. I attended the hearing along with Sienna and a few of Maya's other friends who'd stayed loyal through the years. Corey's family was there too, his mother and sister ready to speak against parole. The board consisted of 5 people who'd reviewed Maya's file and her prison record. She'd been a model inmate with no disciplinary issues, had completed every available rehabilitation program, and had tutored other inmates in literacy. Graham argued that Maya had paid her debt to society and posed no risk of reoffending, that keeping her in prison longer served no purpose except punishment. Corey's mother argued that no amount of time could give her son back, that Maya should serve her full 18 years as punishment for destroying their family. Maya spoke last, and I'd never seen her look so small and broken. She apologized to Corey's family, acknowledging that nothing she said could undo the harm she'd caused. She talked about the person she'd been at 25, reactive and panicked and unable to see options beyond violence in that terrible moment. She said prison had given her years to think about better choices she could have made, ways she could have removed herself from the situation without hurting anyone. She said she carried the weight of Corey's death every single day and would continue carrying it for the rest of her life. She promised that if released, she'd dedicate herself to helping other women in abusive situations find non-violent solutions, that she'd use her experience to prevent others from making similar mistakes. Her voice cracked multiple times as she spoke, and several board members looked genuinely moved. The hearing ended with the board saying they'd deliberate and issue a decision within 2 weeks. We left the prison not knowing whether Maya would be coming home or staying behind bars for another 6 years. The decision came 12 days later. Parole denied. The board stated that while Maya had been rehabilitated, the severity of her crime and the fact that the victim had subsequently died made early release inappropriate. They suggested she reapply in 3 years. I had to call Maya and tell her she'd be spending at least 3 more years in prison, possibly 6 more, if the next parole board also denied her. Her reaction was quiet acceptance, like she'd expected this outcome, and was past the point of hoping for anything different. I raged at the injustice of it. My sister had defended herself and was being punished as if she'd committed premeditated murder. But the system didn't care about context or nuance. It cared about a skull fracture, brain damage, and a death that could be loosely connected to Maya's action, even though 7 years had passed. Maya would be 37 at her earliest possible release, and I'd be 43. We'd both lost so much to one birthday party that should have been a celebration. Now, 15 years later, I visit Maya in prison once a month and bring photos of the life she's missing, my wedding, my children, family gatherings she'll never attend. She smiles at the pictures and says she's happy for me, but the emptiness in her eyes tells the truth. She's still trapped in that hallway at Rusty's bar, still holding a broken bottle, still watching Corey fall while her entire future collapsed alongside him. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.